Right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this afternoon's meeting of the Adults, Communities Overview and Scrutiny Committee, today, Monday, the 24th of January. The meeting will be broadcast live via the County Council's website and will be available for viewing after the meeting. Can everybody please remember the usual niceties of switching on their microphone when they wish to speak and switching it off when they finish. That way we don't get any feedback. And obviously, can people please not connect to the website, because otherwise we get you twice. So just bring up the thing and don't connect to Teams would be extremely useful. So item 1 on the agenda is minutes of the meeting held on the 1st November 2021. I propose that the minutes of the meeting held are taken as read, confirmed and signed. Is everybody in agreement with that? Thank you all. Agenda item 2 is question time. I've received no questions from members of the public. Agenda item 3 is questions asked by members under Standing Order 7.3 and 7.5. I've received no such questions from members. Agenda item 4 is to advise of any other items which the chairman has decided to take as urgent not elsewhere on the agenda. I've not been notified of any urgent items unless anyone has anyone they wish to raise. We now have declarations of interest in respective items on the agenda, and I think, Amanda, you wish to make a declaration.
Yes, just a generalised declaration. I think, as everybody knows, I am involved in health and social care. I'm a lawyer, and as such, there are certain aspects that just from a generalised standpoint, I thought I'd declare. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. No other declarations of interest for anyone? Right, thank you. There have been no declarations from the party whip in accordance with the Overview and Scrutiny Procedure Rule 16, and there have been no petitions, presentation of petitions under Standing Order 35, so none have been received. So we now go into the agenda items, of which the first one on the agenda is item 8, which is the medium-term financial strategy 2022 to 2023, and then the forward projections 2025-26. As set out on pages 15 to 38 of the agenda pack. Clearly we've got John as the lead officer on this one, and the director to give us briefing. I'm also delighted that we have Christine Radford here, the portfolio holder, and Ted Parton, who's the support cabinet assistant, who've come to join us to assist with answering any questions. Now, for members that have been on the committee before, we tend to take this in sections. So what we do is we go through a section. John will present with assistance for any other colleagues that he might wish to call in, and then we will ask questions on each section as we go through it, chops it into nice little chunks if everybody's happy with that. So the first bit we're looking at is service transformation, which is paragraphs 5 to 9 and pages 15 to 16, which I should pass to John, who might also wish to give any sort of small general introduction he may wish to give.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll commence the report as described, looking at the first few paragraphs, which is essentially around background and context. So the report that's been presented today has been prepared in line with delivering wellbeing and opportunity in Leicestershire, which is the Adult and Community Department's Ambitions and Strategy 2020 to 2024. Which demonstrates how the department will contribute towards the authority's strategic plan outcomes. The ambition at the heart of the strategy is to improve well-being for people and communities of Leicestershire, and we will take forward the strategy over the course of the next 4 years in line with this MTFS. Paragraph 6 of the report just outlines the main points within the strategy. So around improving customer experience, providing quality information advice, promoting well-being, promoting independence, having a flexible, talented workforce, having a seamless transition from children's services, and focusing on accommodation with care, and also on the use of technology, the digitalisation of care. It's worth just noting that we've had a plethora of social care reform papers over the course of the last 3 or 4 months. So having waited for them for the last number of years, we now have a number of areas of social care reform that we'll also be taking forward around the health and care bill, which we anticipate could be enacted before the summer recess, alongside the social care white paper, People at the Heart of Care, and the Build Back Better charging reforms that were announced earlier last year. There is a report on today's agenda which covers those reports and those reforms, but it's also worth bearing in mind that this MTFS has also been prepared with those in mind. I think I'll probably just leave it there for context. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Any members, any questions on the first section, context or paragraphs 5 to 9? Joel?
Cheers. Thank you, Chair. On paragraph 6, there's a whole list of things that we're trying to do for the next year, following year. If you took the word Leicestershire out and changed it with any other authority, I presume those lists will be similar for other authorities, I presume. But in Leicestershire, which one, if we had to narrow it down to 1 or 2, which one would be the most important key factor going forward in the next financial year, and which one, the one we put our money behind?
Okay, that's a 2,000 word essay, I think. I'll try and answer that one. So which one's the most important? Well, they're all important. That's why they're in the strategy. That's the first thing to say. Obviously, the most important is to ensure that we've got good customer experience and satisfaction. That's the one that I suppose overarches everything else. And the other areas that are noted in paragraph 6 are intended to ensure that that's the case. So we can't have a good customer experience and good customer satisfaction without having a talented and flexible and motivated workforce. Equally, the importance of accommodation for people with care needs is been highlighted over a number of years, and as you know, in Leicestershire we've been investing in that for the last few years, and we want to continue to do that. We want to develop our ability to support people digitally, because that's going to be important. We've seen through the pandemic over the last 2 years that digital connectivity and access is essential as we go forward with services, but also we want to ensure that we are harnessing all the benefits that technology can bring to people living in their own homes particularly, but also people in care. So all of them are important, but obviously the ultimate aim is to ensure that people have a good level of support and advice, and that people are satisfied with the services that they receive from the council.
Thank you. I'll leave it there. I may touch back on it later. Thank you.
Any other members?
Thank you, Chair. John, just picking up on that digital connectivity, etc. Obviously, that's going to be quite a challenge because you're dealing with people, elderly people that are not used to using technology in the first place. So you've got that to deal with. And also, I mean, we're all working from home a lot using digital technology, but coming up against the problems with broadband and that kind of thing. Do you see problems in the future? Obviously, just alone in making sure that people have got the, I mean, when 5G comes in, perhaps that gives us what we need. But do you think we've got at the moment the infrastructure to be able to deal with that?
I think it's developing. So as you say, a number of people that we work with, particularly, whether it's older people or whether it's people with disabilities, may have particular barriers to accessing information, advice and support digitally. Having said that, of course, the vast majority of contacts that we have with people are actually with either professional organisations, professionals from other organisations, or with family members. So if you look at sort of contacts through the customer service centre, for example, 80% of those contacts are either from family members or from professionals. But nevertheless, we do need to bear in mind that some people may have those barriers, and we need to work with people to ensure that they can access services. I mean, when we talk about digital connectivity and moving towards a more digital approach to some of our services, it's not an exclusive approach. So we will still obviously maintain all the normal channels of communication that we do now, be that telephone or be that through in written form or through individual and personal visits to people. All of that will be maintained. But we also need to recognise that the world is moving on. And in 2025, we'll be having the digital switchover. And if we're not prepared for that, then we will not be able to give people the sort of services that they will require and will want to see.
Any further questions? Sorry, Christine.
Can I just comment, because everybody knows how techno I'm not, but the one advantage I think of the COVID is that a lot of older people did learn technology and that, and learned how to get onto Facebook and stuff like that to their grandchildren. So I don't think it's going to be quite so frightening for them, but it isn't just for them to do that, it's for us to help them in other ways as well. So we're looking at it as a broad area.
Thank you, Christine. Any further questions on this section? If that's the case, we now move on to the next section, which is the proposed revenue budget, other changes and transfers, which is paragraphs 10 to 16 on pages 16 to 18 and Appendix A on pages 31 to 32. Back to you, John.
Thank you. So paragraph 10 has a table there which summarises the proposed 22-23 revenue budget and the provisional budgets for the next 3 years. Within the table, you'll note that we have a original prior year budget. We then have some budget transfers and adjustments. So what that gives us is £156 million worth of carry forward from the previous year. And in addition to that, we're proposing growth of 25.8 million and savings of 11 million, which would give us a proposed provisional net budget for the coming year of 171.5 million. Worth just saying, as it says in paragraph 11, that 171.5 million doesn't include any allowance for pay or price inflation. The way the council operates, price inflation is that the council holds a central contingency, which would then be allocated to budgets later in the year. So paragraph 12 then just outlines how that £171.5 million is allocated and spent. As you can see, 88% of that funding is directly spent on demand-led commissioned services for people. That's services, whether that's in people's own homes or in care homes or in day services. It's services that we purchase and commission on behalf of people. We have around just about 9% of our total spend is on council's direct services. The next couple of areas are our locality social care teams, what we call the care pathway. Strategic services covers things like market management, contract compliance, quality improvement. And then towards the bottom, you'll see that there is a £26.5 million contribution, so that's income through the Better Care Fund, and 5.1 million on community and wellbeing services with it. So that's how we make up the 171 net budget, and the gross budget for 2022-23 is 294 million, and that includes a projected income of 122.9 million. The paragraph 13 just outlines the transfers that were made in this financial year, the 5.2 million that's outlined in the table at paragraph 10 on budget transfers. That's the detail that goes behind that. And then just a couple of paragraphs just to explain some of the way that we've outlined the growth and savings. And it's the way that we usually do this in the MTFS in the council. So each element will have either a star, 2 stars, or no stars, which indicates whether it's an unchanged item, a changed item from a previous MTFS, or a new item. And we also then just note whether or not on the savings, whether it's an efficiency saving or a service reduction or a mixture of both. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, John. Any questions? Bill?
Thank you, Chair. I think the director touched on it, and the biggest thing in the economy at the moment is inflation, both wage inflation and inflation in general. And I think he's explained the reasons why we have a contingency in the council as a whole. But I think that's going to be one of our biggest challenges in this financial year, balancing the demands of our care providers who are potentially asking for more money so they can deliver the services, and ourselves to balance our budget. Can I ask? He's explained in a little bit about what we have and how we will resource it. But what are the dangers to our care providers? Because we don't provide most of the care; it's the private sector that does it in Leicestershire. What are the dangers if controls do get out of hand, and what support can we provide them to keep them in business, basically? Thank you.
That sounds like another 2001 for you, John.
Yes, thank you. I'll start to answer in terms of some of the issues for providers, and touch on how we then consider inflation. But it might well be that Judy Spence, who's the finance business partner, who is, I think, joined the meeting today virtually, might want to also just talk about how the council allocates price and cost inflation. In terms of the providers, obviously the largest element of cost for providers is workforce. We know that the national living wage is going up by 6.6% in April. So that's a significant increase that we will have to meet, because clearly we have a duty to make sure that the prices we pay for care are realistic and that it's a real kind of cost of the service. So we do need to meet the costs of the wage bill for providers. In addition to that, there's the element of normal inflation, price inflation. So we'll have to take a view as to what we think is a reasonable level of price inflation for providers into the coming year. And then we'll do a calculation that brings together those two elements to come up with what we think is a reasonable and a realistic level of inflation that we would want to apportion to our contracts with providers. So that's the kind of the way that we would normally work. Obviously, the providers contact us, so we get quite a lot of information from them in terms of what they think their costs are, and we work with the market, social care market, to come up with what we think is a reasonable level. But I don't know if Judith wants to add to that.
Thanks, John. Yeah, we support the providers with inflation through several ways at the moment. We have a lot of government grants which are targeted at supporting providers with their costs. We try to keep an annual review of what we call a standardised uplift rate, and we do take independent advice on that. From a corporate point of view, they expect departments to manage the inflation, and we do get challenged on that. But to date, they've allocated our requirements for that inflation. Going forward, I think there will be some more grants in 22-23, which will help support providers, and it will be for us as a department to work with our independent advisor to manage any costs that are outside of that grant, which may be excessive. But it is cash limited, the contingency fund, so we would have to balance that with the needs of other departments.
Thank you, Judith. I think it's just worth noting at this point that I've sat on the committee now for the last few years, that particularly for new members, if we go back, we've been uniquely successful, I think, in adults community in taking costs out of the system whilst maintaining services, which I think has held us in good stead for where we are now. Clearly, the council has also made difficult decisions to put up council tax to take the adult and social care additional precept has been allowed to ensure that we fund this area. Obviously, I can't commit to what the council might be considering this year, but it's those difficult decisions which have been taken by the council over years, which I think has held this in good stead. And I think it is worth noting, as I said earlier, the work on efficiency that's been done by the department, so that whilst the pandemic has clearly put strains on, as we can see from the increase in budget and resources, at least we were in a far better position to face that challenge when it happened than we might otherwise have been had we not taken those previous actions. We now move on to paragraphs 17 to 32 on pages 18 to 21. And G5 to G10 in Appendix B on page 33, which relate to the growth aspects. John has already given commentary on how they're shown with stars or not, as the case may be. So he's taken half my word in a way from me, but he's clearly keeping me from saying too much. So if you'd like to now take the growth section, please, John.
Thank you. Having had that wonderful introduction in terms of how efficient we've been, I now come to the section of the report which details the required growth over the next 4 years. And as you'll see within the report, we are looking at a very significant and very substantial amount of growth. £25 million in the next financial year, rising to £35 million over 4 years. I think it's probably worth just noting that that's, I think, probably the single biggest growth request that we have ever put forward. So it's not insignificant for the council, but it is a reflection of the increased demand that we've seen over the course of the last 18 months and the increased cost of delivering services over that period. It's very difficult to extrapolate over a 4-year period given the current situation that we're in. And therefore, it's reasonable to expect that as we go through the MTFS period over 4 years, and as we revise the MTFS over that period, there will be other changes that will come forward. But certainly, as we sit here today, having looked at the demand for social care services and the increase in cost in those services over the course of the last 12 months, it is clear that we need a significant amount of growth in the next 12 months in order to ensure that we've got sufficient funding to meet the needs that are coming forward. There are a couple of charts in the papers at paragraph 20 and paragraph 21, which just note that significant growth. And it says in paragraph 20, we normally expect between 1 and 1.5% growth per annum. And what we've seen over the last year or so is a 5% growth rate, which is above anything that we've seen previously. And equally at paragraph 21, you can see that there's a fairly, it's not a straight line, it's a jagged line, but it's going in only in one direction in terms of the average cost of care over the period. So that's why we put forward such large amounts of growth. Paragraph 23 starts to get into the detail then of where that growth will lay within the department. We do this on the basis of areas of client need as opposed to sort of the provision itself. So we look at older people's demand first. Older people services account for most of the department's expenditure. And as you'd imagine, over the course of the last 18 months, that's where we've seen the majority of the growth requirement. So what we've got there is £15 million in 22-23, rising to 17.7 million by the end of the MTFS period. Much of this is driven by the people coming out of hospital. As you know, hospitals have been intensely busy over the last 2 years. Health services have been under a deal of pressure. That means that there is an increased number of people who are being discharged from hospital who require social care services over and above anything we've seen before. And those people who are being discharged with really quite high levels of need back into the community. So we're having to pick up much higher levels of social care provision than we had previously. That's shown itself in terms of increased amounts of home care required, and we've delivered an extra 5,000 hours of home care over the last 2 years than what we were providing previously. It's also meant that we have many more people in temporary residential placements because the home care services are stretched. we sometimes it can take a couple of weeks sometimes to arrange a home care package for somebody on discharge, and therefore we place people in temporary residential care, and the numbers of people going into temporary residential care have gone up by at least 75% over that period. So all of that adds to increased cost, not only because we've got increased numbers of people, but also because the cost of provision has increased significantly over the period of the pandemic, which results in that amount of demand for older people's services. The next area of demand is learning disability services. And again, we've got here 5.2 million in 2022, rising to 9.4 million by 25-26. Much of this demand comes again from people who are being discharged from hospital. These are different placements. These are more specialist long-term placements often. People who are accommodated in healthcare provision, who need to really be in the community and to receive their support in the community. It's what we call the Transforming Care Programme. It's a national programme to ensure that people have the right support in the right place at the right time. But many of these people are people with very, very complex needs. And the provision that we therefore put in place for people coming out of transforming care arrangements tends to be very bespoke. It tends to require specialist accommodation with specialist care teams, very intensive care, and is very high cost. We also have a number of people every year who transition from children's services to adult services, between about 80 and 100 people a year who come through from children's services, who we make provision for. And of course, we've seen a change in that provision over the course of the pandemic. So again, an amount of additional demand, but also quite a lot of additional cost in those service areas. Paragraph 28 and 29, and I just apologise for paragraph 29. Those of you who are eagle-eyed will see that paragraph 29 is a repeat of paragraph 28. In actual fact, so paragraph 28 refers to people with mental health needs. Paragraph 29 refers to people with physical disabilities. Although it is a repeat, actually what would be in those two paragraphs, other than the fact that the name would be different, would be similar, because the mental health services and physical disability services, unlike learning disability, where we can predict with some certainty what the numbers of people will be, it's much more difficult to predict with mental health and physical disability, because these tend to be acquired illnesses or disabilities, rather than people who we can see, transitioning from children's services or transitioning from health services. But nevertheless, there is growth in both those two areas at a lesser degree, a lesser extent, but nevertheless, there is some significant growth of around about 2 million up to 3.5 million in both areas. So they're the areas of demand growth, of demographic growth, if you like. And then there are two separate areas of growth that we've put forward this year. The first is a market premium. So this is paragraph 30 in the report. Market premium is paid for posts which are difficult to recruit to, or where we have difficulty in retaining staff, and where we know that we need to put in a premium on top of salary in order to attract people. We've been doing this for a couple of years on some of our social work posts particularly, but we've not been funded for it as a department. So we've been carrying that cost. We've put forward in this MTFS round some growth to allow us to continue to do that, in order to ensure that we can continue to maintain adequate staffing levels. It also covers the department. We have a grow your own scheme, if you like. So rather than always being at the behest of the market and competing with all other authorities for social work particularly, we have a scheme in place which allows us to grow our own. So we train our own social work staff. We think it's a better model in the long run. We think that we can retain people. We know that the people who are going on those courses are people who we can rely on. So it's a better model. It's a more cost-effective model, and it obviously shows value to our staff group. Paragraph 32 is the last area of growth. £500,000 for the social care investment programme. We've been running this for 3 years. We ran the programme initially as a pilot using some non-recurrent funding. We're now in the place where we need to continue that funding and also expand the remit. So we started off in adults. We're now running similar programs in children's. The investment that we're seeking today is actually not just in adults, but this 500,000 also covers the investment required for the children and family services, and also for corporate services, for property services and other colleagues who also need to be involved in the acquisition of properties and the renovation of properties. So that £500,000 is there to run the social care investment programme across the council. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, John. Questions? Ross first.
Thanks, Chair. So my question's on the G6 learning disability group. We're seeing demand almost double within a couple of years. Could you just expand on kind of what the pressures are within this area on why we're seeing such a quick increase?
Well, it's probably presentational in terms of it looking like it's doubled. So after, as I said earlier, the biggest element of spend in the department is on older people services. The second biggest element is on learning disability services. So we do spend a considerable amount of money, tens of millions of pounds on people with learning disabilities. So it's not that the growth is doubling. It goes probably back to more to the fact that we contained growth for a number of years. And actually, if you look at the growth requirement that we've had in learning disability services over the last 3 years compared to other similar authorities, you'd see that it was probably lower in Leicestershire than elsewhere. But we are at a point now where particularly the Transforming Care programme is running at a faster pace than it has previously. We have a much more robust Transforming Care strategy across Leicestershire with health partners. We did have a very high number of people comparatively nationally. We had a high number of people with learning disabilities who were in inpatient care, who are in hospitals, being cared for and accommodated in hospitals. And we're doing our utmost to try to reduce that number and to bring people back into the community wherever possible. The other issue is that, as I said earlier, the cost of care has risen quite steeply in this area, partly because if we're developing properties for people, and they tend to be bespoke, but as you're probably aware, construction costs, building costs have just sort of soared over the last 18 months, and that's affecting us in terms of the accommodation. The cost of the actual care itself has increased, partly because the people that we're bringing out of hospital are people with very complex needs now, so they require very intensive care packages, but also because the price for care in this area has gone up substantially over the course of the last couple of years. So we are paying a lot more for the care, over and above what we could have paid perhaps even 2 years ago.
Thanks, Ross. Anyone else? Linda?
Thank you, Chair. I think the growth is quite frightening, and I accept what the Chair said. As a department, the savings that have happened in the past have really helped. But obviously, with anything, all savings come to an end. You can only cut the fat off the bone so many times, and you get to the end point, which it is quite frightening, really, especially as we've got an older population. I want to ask, you said about you're having to place people into temporary accommodation because care packages aren't ready and things. What's the average that people are in temporary accommodation? You also asked, it mentioned about the complex needs. Are these complex needs dealt with in-house or in area? Because I do know that obviously if you have to send people with complex needs out of area, it costs a lot more money. And do we have the capacity to deal with these complex needs in area? The market premium that you mentioned, I just hope that it's difficult, because when the Hay scheme was brought in, market premium was supposed to go out of the window. But I do accept that there are areas that need market premium because you won't get them. I am concerned that in future, a lot of care staff are classed as lower workers, and yet it is a skilled job, but they are at the end of the pay chain. And I do see a thing in the future whereby these people, because we can't recruit as it is, I'm not saying they're going to be paid market premium, but I can see that they're going to be moved up the scale because they're going to be needed, which is also going to put a lot of pressure, certainly on the department. I'm presuming all these things have been thought about, that are going to possibly pop up and bite us very soon. But if you could just answer me about the temporary and the complex needs, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. So how long do people stay, I think was the question, in temporary care? Difficult to say. Under the current guidance that we have in place, the NHS fund people for the first 4 weeks of care when they come out of hospital. So we try out wherever possible to find people appropriate care within that 4-week period. We don't do that for everybody, I have to say. I think we're about 80% at the moment that would get a review and a service within that period. Some people, of course, one of the issues with placing people in temporary care is that people decondition, which is a odd word, but effectively it just means that people lose some of their independence if they're in a care home when they don't need to be. So we do our utmost to get people out as quickly as possible, and we know that the longer somebody stays, the less chance there is that they will go home eventually. I don't know what the actual average is. I'll find out for you. I do know that we've got currently probably around about 400 people in temporary placements in Leicestershire. Pre-pandemic, that would have been probably around about 100 or less. So a significant increase over that period. As I say, we do our utmost to get people home as quickly as practically possible, because it's in their best interest, it's in our best interest, in everybody's best interest, really. But it can be difficult sometimes, and sometimes we don't always know exactly what the needs of the person is on discharge, and sometimes it is the case that actually people are, probably more suited to remaining in care. Small number of people are suited to remaining in care. But yeah, I'll try to find out the average, if you like. Oh, complex needs. Yes, sorry. Now we do provide those in area, not in house. Partly because, as I said, some of the care that people require is quite specialist, and it's not something that necessarily the county council is best equipped to provide. There are providers out there who provide for that particular group of people, and have got a very large amount of experience and skill in doing that. We do always try to keep people in the area, though, and we are working with a whole range of organisations to ensure that that's the case. So we've had 2 or 3 new developments come on stream in the last year or so that cater specifically for people who have very complex needs. It can take an awful long time to get people out of hospital who have been in healthcare for many years. It's quite a long transition period. So not always in-house, but always within area. Can't think of one recently where it's not been in area.
Thanks, John. Joel?
Thank you, Chair. Just touching on the chart or the graph on paragraph 21, is that average cost per user, service user per week? 480 odd pounds. It is, because if you then look at paragraph 23, that 15.5 million pounds, 15.4 million, that pays for about 650 people. Is that correct, approximately? It's not a lot of people.
I haven't got my maths with me, but
to pay 15 million.
I'll believe you if you say that's what it is.
Yeah.
I suppose what you have to remember, particularly with older people's services, is that there's quite a high turnover rate. So we wouldn't expect there to under normal year, and in a normal year, we, as I said, we'd expect 1.5% growth overall. So we wouldn't expect there to be a large increase in the numbers of people, because clearly we do have large numbers of people who are entering care services, but we also have large numbers of people who are leaving care services. So it might not seem like a large number of people, but actually there's a probably about 30% turnover in any given year. People tend to stay in care for about 2 to 3 years on average. So it's yeah.
Thank you, John. Just one from me, John, which I hope is a positive thing. For the first time, well, for the first time ever, I've seen planning applications within my own division for specialist accommodation for people with learning difficulties and people with disabled issues, which I think is massively positive. So are we actually seeing the start of a more holistic integrated care system of registered providers being funded to provide specialist accommodation? And do you see this being driven through the Better Care Fund as it finishes and the integrated care system that's coming in? So do you see positive aspects to this? Because I think the report makes the point that these people it might cost more, but it's far better if they have a better quality of life in their own accommodation.
Yeah, certainly I think that is the case. And clearly when we started our investment programme as a council, we kind of recognised that there wasn't enough investment in this area, which is why the council agreed to put some capital forward to start a kind of a process off. But we are seeing now that we have many more registered landlords who are coming forward to develop properties and to develop schemes. We know within the part of the new reform agenda, there's a specific element on housing and accommodation with care. And I think, I'm not top of my head, Nigel will know because he's doing the report next, but I think it's about 300 million nationally that's being put forward to help providers to provide specialist accommodation. So I think we will see more.
Thanks, John. In the absence of further questions, we now move on to savings adult social care, which is paragraphs 33 to 51 on pages 21 to 24. And is AC1 to AC12 on Appendix C on page 35. Thanks, John.
Thank you. So yes, moving on to savings. So we've talked about the growth and the very substantial numbers in the growth. We also have some substantial numbers in the savings. So we've got a savings target in 22-23 of 11 million, which rises up to just under 16 million over the next 4 years. And clearly, as we go through each year, we will be asked to bring forward further savings, and notwithstanding Mrs. Broadley's comments that when will the savings ever end, I'm sure that there will be further savings that we will bring forward over the course of the next 4 years. But those that we've got in the report today, I'll go through each one individually. So what we call AC1, paragraph 34, is an increased income line. Just over £1 million in 22-23, rising to 1.5 million over the period. And this is simply because we know that over that period, a large amount of our income comes from older people. And we know that over that period, through the triple lock and through the pensions schemes and benefit schemes, people's income will increase, and therefore the amount of contribution that they make to their social care services will increase. So we can be fairly confident that we will receive additional income over the period. AC2, paragraph 35, is a saving attached to the social care investment plan. We've just been talking about social care investment in accommodation. We have a £200,000 saving next year, which rises up to just under £1 million over the period. And this is a saving that arises from people having less intensive care, people moving from residential and long-term care into the community, but also because we want to develop more extra care housing as an alternative to residential care for older adults. And we want to develop a specialist dementia unit because we know that there is a shortage of specialist dementia care within Leicestershire. And we think that if we develop that accommodation and possibly the provision in-house, we think that we can also make some cost savings through some of the high cost placements that we make in the independent sector. AC3 again is an income line. It's the Better Care Fund income, and we know that there will be an annual uplift to the amount that we get through the Better Care Fund, so we can be fairly confident in that amount. AC4 at paragraph 20 is, I suppose, the tail end of the dividend from the operating model work, the target operating model work that we did. So we've already accounted for around about £8 million worth of efficiency savings through that programme. But over the course of this MTFS, we anticipate there being just over another £1 million that will come out over the period. AC5, paragraph 41 is the digital assistive technology saving. So this is the work that we're doing with Hampshire County Council to develop care technology over the next 4 years. The saving is £350,000 in the next financial year, rising to just over £2 million in 24-25. We did have a business case, which I think committee have seen before, which suggested that there was a saving in the region of £2 to £5 million by introducing the technology. We've taken a fairly conservative estimate of that, and we put 2.25 in this MTFS. But I suspect that over the course of the next year, we'll have a look at that and see whether or not, as implementation commences, whether that 2.25 million can be stretched. Paragraph 43 refers to staffing savings in the department. So £450,000 in 22-23, rising to £800,000 by 23-24. We have just completed a whole series of staff action plans across the whole of the department, which will come into effect from April of this year. So the 22-23 saving is we can be fairly confident about. 87 digital self-service. So in addition to the care technology work that we're doing, we're beginning to now to do some work around having a more digital access. So this is the first element of it, which is around financial assessments and financial services. And we think that we can make a saving here, partly through a more efficient process, but also by achieving a higher level of income. It just, I think it's just a typo in terms of the dates there. I think it should say 22-23 rather than 21-22. Paragraph 45, a review of the mental health pathway. £500,000 saving, rising to £750,000 by the end of 23-24. This is essentially enabling people to live more independently in the community. Numbers of people with mental illness are still accommodated in residential and long-term care. We think we can support people to live more independently. We are commissioning a floating support service that will come in from June of this year, which will help people to live in their own homes, in their own tenancies with support. Paragraph 46 is a review of placements transitioning from children's services. This is part of the children's services, designing children's services for the future programme with Newton Europe. When we did the operating model work in the adults department, we deliberately didn't do any work in transitions services between children and adults. Now the programme has moved into children's services. We have a programme of work which is working with the children's disability team and the adults preparing for adulthood team. So these savings will come forward as part of that programme. AC 10 paragraph 47 is a review of our direct in-house services, and it details there the 3 areas that we're looking to make some efficiency savings from. So that's through a restructure of the Melton short breaks and supported living services. It's through not taking forward the redevelopment of the short break service in Colville, but rather using the refurbished trees in Hinckley. And it's in connection with the recent decision to reduce the amount of in-house community life choices services and commission those from an external source. Paragraph 48, AC 11, is a saving being brought forward through a review of partly the conversation we just had around reviewing people who are discharged into temporary accommodation, but also other high cost placements. So it's a continual review process. We've had this one in previously, and we've been successful in achieving efficiency savings through those review processes. Paragraph 51, AC 12 is a new area, and it's £6 million. So it's a significant area. This is to do with the fact that over the last 2 years, since we've had the pandemic and since we've had the new discharge to assess process, the NHS have supported the first 4 weeks of care. That support is due to come to an end nationally in March. Our view is that as a local authority, in order to remain sustainable and in order for us to be able to continue to provide appropriate care for people on discharge, we would need that funding to continue, whether it's through a national fund or through a local arrangement. And that amount of money is the amount of money that we would need from the NHS in order for us to continue to provide the sort of care that we have been doing over the last 2 years.
You're at the end there, John.
I think I'm at the end.
Yep. Yeah, don't go to AC 13. You might upset somebody in there. Any questions on that section at all? Sure.
Cheers. Thank you, Chair. I was going to concentrate on, there's quite a bit of cuts, unfortunately, but AC 10 and AC 12. So AC 10 this is actually where, when we say we don't reduce services for our residents, this is exactly how we reduce services for our residents. These little small cuts actually make big differences to people's lives, and I think for the amount of money that we're trying to save, it's going to make massive impacts on the people that use these services, especially for the supported living services. I'd rather we didn't make these cuts, but I'm not in a position to argue to the contrary. But AC 12, which is the £6 million, and this is what gets me actually when we're looking at budgets. This amount, John, if I'm right, isn't agreed or hasn't been agreed by anybody in the NHS at this moment in time, post-March this year. But it's in our budget, and we're expecting it to balance the books, as they say, going forward, because it's 6 million this year, 6 million next year, 6 million the year after, and 6 million the year after that. But it's not agreed. And I'm astonished that something that isn't agreed is in our budget for us to just wave through or nod through. So I just wanted to query that. And that's of all the things that I've seen, that's the one that sits least within me, because if that 6 million doesn't come through, that means we have to find additional £6 million worth of savings that we haven't looked at this moment in time to balance the books for the next year. And if we were to pass to scrutiny anything, this would be the biggest red flag in our budget at this moment in time. Thank you.
So I'll just respond to both points. So AC 10 is not a service reduction, it's not a cut, it's an efficiency saving. So we're not suggesting that by restructuring Melton short breaks and supported living services, there will be fewer people receiving a service or that people will receive less of a service. It's simply a staffing restructure. The closure of Smith Crescent, or rather than not redeveloping Smith Crescent and using the trees, actually increases the number of short breaks beds in the council and across the county. So it's not a reduction in service as such. There will actually be 2 extra beds, albeit that clearly people who live in North West Leicestershire will have to travel further. And the Community Life Choices service, we are providing less in-house, but we will commission those services externally. So it's not that nobody should see a reduction in service as a result of that decision. In terms of AC12, there is a risk. There's absolutely a risk. As I said, the national funding is due to come to an end in March. We haven't had any guarantee that funding will continue. There is clearly an amount of conversation and discussion taking place nationally around this, not just by us, but by every local authority in the country. There's an amount of conversation taking place with the NHS around the fact that they will need to continue to fund it. I think it's a perfectly reasonable expectation. We have the additional 12 billion that will come from the national insurance increase in April. I think this is a perfectly reasonable expectation that this will be funded through that funding. The reason that the NHS began to fund the first 4 weeks of care, the reason why that funding was put in place in the first place when the pandemic started, was because in taking forward the new policy around discharge, they effectively took away people's right of choice on discharge. So previously, people had a legal right to an assessment in hospital before they were discharged, in order to determine what sort of care they wanted and what care arrangements would be in place. The new discharge process doesn't allow for that, and therefore the NHS took on the funding of the first few weeks of care for people to allow for that assessment to then take place out of hospital, those decisions to be made. So I think it's perfectly reasonable the NHS will continue to fund that. We'll see, won't we? But you're right, there is a risk there. There's a risk to all of the income lines in a sense, because the income that's around increased contributions is a risk. I spoke about the fact that we're fairly confident that pensions will increase, and therefore, but actually there has been things in the news about the triple lock. So there is a risk attached. I agree. There isn't. I can't sit here and say there isn't.
Linda.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, John, you've just answered it. As far as pensioners, of which I am one, are concerned, the triple lock has gone. So therefore, that's one thing. And there's quite a few things in here. The other one is about, actually I can't find it while I'm desperately looking for it. We don't know what's going on. We're local councillors, county councillors. We don't know what's going on in London and what's true and what's not true with half the things that are happening. But if you listen to some of it, there is a lot in here, like Joel says, that we can't rely on. I can understand why it's here. But I do think that, and as I said before, I think it's frightening, the fact that this could all be, we could agree this, and in the next month, 2 months, 3 months, who knows, it could all be totally different. And we've got to then work and try and bring some of this back to how we can manage the budgets. And I think, really, as a layperson, I think it's quite frightening, and I don't envy you your position.
Barry.
Thank you, Chair. John, when you go through these efficiency savings, and I'll just pick one that I've been involved in more recently with the community life choices. Obviously, we come up with the ideas on how we can make these savings, we enact that. The other end of that, what do we do to go back over and see how that has impacted the people themselves? Was it a good saving, or did we do more damage than good? I'm more interested in moving forward. What do we do to reappraise ourselves and see if what we've done is the right thing?
I suppose it's different with each one. Certainly, we have individual reviews that are in place for individuals that are affected by any of the savings or the efficiencies that we bring forward. So we always we never change a person's care without reviewing them first, sitting down with them and their families and having a review initially. We will then sit down again with people after any changes taken place, and we'll again review how that's gone and what's happened, etc. We do collate that information so we can report back on it. We also have service user engagement groups that we can talk to about impact of different changes that we're proposing or different changes that we've made. So we can talk to people who use services to get their perspective in the round. I think that's certainly something that, as we go through the social care reform agenda, we'll be doing much more of that kind of, I want a better word, co-production with people. I think it's difficult in some areas. It's more difficult in some areas than in others. The CLC one is probably an easier one because we know who the people are and people are likely to be with us for a considerable length of time, so we can have that kind of longer term view. In some areas it's more difficult because people have shorter interventions. But yeah, I mean, it's something that we probably ought to do a bit more of actually over time.
Right, Chair. So would we get reports come back to us with the results of obviously decisions we've made? That, as I say, in CLC, we've made a decision to allow us to go forward with these savings. Will we get a report back to let us know how well that's gone, not just in the savings, but also in the impacts?
If committee want a report, I'm very happy to bring one at the appropriate time.
Thanks, John. Anyone else? Oh, sorry, Christine.
Can I assure the rest of the people that when we modernised and altered the trees at Hinkley, people were a bit reluctant to move out, but they don't want to move back now because they like where they've gone. So we do keep in touch with them and contact them. And I can assure you that Ted and I will be looking at it. We were with sorry, I've got a bad cold coming. But sitting with somebody the other day, weren't we, on board, listening to people with disabilities. Yeah. So we will carry on looking at it.
Thanks, Christine. I'll just make an observation, really. And it's something Linda said about, I think you said, John, I don't envy you your job. Well, it's not John's job, it's our job, sadly. So John makes recommendations. So we as the members decide on the budget. So again, we can amend the budget. And I think what John was saying is we've got two options. We can either use our best information to determine whether we're going to receive income included in the budget. Or I think Jill would rather it's perhaps left out of the budget, in which case you'd have to decide where you wanted to make those savings, which other departments or where else, Jill. So I suppose it will be a question of coming up with your alternative budget of where you take that 6 million from if you didn't feel that it was going to be. And so it's difficult. I mean, it's our best guesstimate based on all the information and experience we have that goes into this. And therefore, there will always be elements of uncertainty, both on cost and income. And that's just the natural life of a budget. So, I, for one, think it would be sensible to leave it in there based on how else are they going to do it, but we could be proved wrong. Any more questions on this section? No? Right, we'll now move on to savings, communities and wellbeing, paragraphs 52 to 53, pages 24 to 25, AC 13 and Appendix C, page 35.
Thank you. So just two paragraphs to look at here. The first is paragraph 52, which is the implementation of revised service for communities and wellbeing. So this is one that we had in previously. £30,000 in 22-23, rising to 170,000 by the end of 23-24. It's part of the previous improvements that we did. We did a restructure a couple of years ago, which took a significant amount of saving out of the budget, and this is the sort of the tail end of that. And we are also looking at a potential further review of services, including mobile library services, where we know that there's been a reducing number of people who use the service, and where we think we could remodel the service or consider alternatives to the current mobile library service, such as home visiting or user volunteers and the use of technology. And then paragraph 53, we're just also noting further work that is taking place to review the options for the relocation of the record office and the creation of a collections hub. And we're hoping that we'll be able to make a decision over the course of the next few months around the potential allocation of capital, which would potentially then release revenue savings for those services.
Thank you, John. Any questions? Well, you've got away with that one nicely, John. So we're now moving on to savings under development, paragraph 54, page 25.
Thank you. We're always asked when we prepare the MTFS report to also consider other areas that we might want to develop for future review of the MTFS as we go through the next 12 months. Two areas that we are looking at are the further digitalisation of service delivery. We talked about that earlier. And we talked about the fact that we're bringing forward some work around developing online financial assessments. We're also looking at whether we could undertake online care assessments, so where people could have more involvement and more control of the how their care is assessed, and where people could have a sort of account and a care account with the council. And that, we think, potentially brings in some cashable savings and some avoided cost. And as I said earlier, we put in a fairly conservative £2.25 million saving on the digital technology, the care technology. So we will go back and we'll review whether or not we can extend that, given that the diagnostic suggested that there was probably 5 million rather than 2 million. We'll have a look at whether we can bring forward further savings in that area. I think that's all there is on that one.
Thanks, John. Just a bit of a clarification on 54A, the last line. If we talk about the latter part of the MTFS, should that really say 2022?
Probably the latter part of 22-23.
Right.
If that makes sense. So yeah, fourth quarter of the financial year. We start to bring forward savings.
So we're not talking about the latter part of the MTFS, we're talking about this year's MTFS.
The latter part of this year's MTFS rolling into the next.
So that's just where I was seeking clarification. Thanks, John. Any questions, Barry?
Thank you, Chair. John, just going back with digitalisation we were talking about earlier on, and as you're saying that in many cases you'll be relying on family members, etc., to help in that. What's the procedures for that? Are these people going to have power of attorney? Because obviously, you know, you try and ring up your doctors to deal with an elderly relative, they don't want to talk to you. You've got to go through some procedures. Have we thought about how we're going to make sure that's simple for people to allow older people to have their carers deal with you direct?
Yeah, we do. I mean, we do have systems in place already. So the only difference with digitalisation is that we're doing it online through a computer rather than doing it by sending somebody a letter or somebody filling in a form. So the process in terms of governance, in terms of data security, in terms of confidentiality and permissions remains the same. We just apply it in a different way. So all of those things are already in place in terms of whether it's a power of attorney or whether it's just as simple as ensuring that we've got consent from an individual, so for somebody else to act on their behalf. I mean, obviously it's a little bit more complicated if you're doing it remotely, but there are ways of doing it. So we'll just apply those same techniques.
So no further questions. Then we move on to Health and Social Care Integration, paragraphs 55 to 63, pages 25 to 26. Thank you, John.
Yes, health and care integration. So as we mentioned earlier, we've got the new health and care bill going through Parliament, looking at developing integrated care systems, but health and care integration isn't anything new. We've been receiving funding through the NHS, through the Better Care Fund since 2015-16. There is a table on paragraph 59 which outlines the current Better Care Fund and the contributions. So you can see there that the total Better Care Fund is now £65.8 million. The CCGs allocate 43.7 million. The council allocates 17.7 million. And in addition to that, we have the £4.4 million worth of capital through the Disabled Facilities Grant. Paragraph 58 just outlines the national conditions and the policy conditions that determine how that money has to be spent. At the moment, £19.4 million of the CCG's contribution is used to sustain adult social care services, and that's the minimum allocation they have to apply. But then in addition to that minimum allocation, actually there's a further 6.6 million which the CCGs provide funding for social care services that are commissioned through the council. We believe that the Better Care Fund has been successful and continues to be successful. We think it will probably expand over future years. We know that there's a small uplift, £0.5 million uplift to the Improved Better Care Fund, which is the county council's element of it in this financial year. And as we said earlier, we know that there will be an allocation, an uplift to the CCG allocation in the next financial year. So it's an extremely important source of income, without which the council would not be able to sustain its adult social care services. Again, you could say there's a level of uncertainty there, in the sense that it's money that we receive as income from another organisation, but it is something that we factor into our budget and that we are reliant on receiving in order to provide some of those integrated services that, particularly around hospital discharge and around we call home first reablement and that kind of service.
Thank you, John. Any questions? No. I'm going to be radical then, John. We've got other external influences and other funding sources, paragraph 64 and 65. Should we take them both at the same time?
I think you could probably do that. So the other external influences, we just noted down a few areas where there are ongoing levels of uncertainty and that could influence the MTFS. So the first is obviously the ongoing impact of COVID. And we talked a bit about that in terms of how we set the growth for this year, but we don't know exactly what's going to happen. We're all in that level of uncertainty. I think it's pretty clear that we'll still be working with the impact of the pandemic at least for another 12 months. But what that will look like, we don't know. And what we don't know is how much additional government grant the council will receive in respect to that. We know that there is a commitment to adult social care reform, and we've got a paper on that coming up, but we're not sure exactly how that will be funded or what funding allocation will be made, either nationally or to the council. There is a court judgment, which is often referred to as the Norfolk Judgment, which impacts on, potentially impacts on council's ability to charge people for their care. And it might mean that we will see a reduced level of income from some of our service users. And of course, we've got the increased cost of care that we talked about earlier, particularly around workforce and the national living wage, and the fact that because care is becoming more scarce, both in terms of home care and in terms of residential care, actually, the cost of that care are likely to increase. So they're the kind of the other factors that we might have to think about as we go through the MTFS period. Paragraph 65 then just outlines a number of different sources of funding and grant funding and income that the council gets and is reliant on. And it's just a bit of detail around some of the smaller grants and schemes that we achieve each year, as well as the larger amounts around things like the Skills Funding Agency, which supports the adult learning programme, over £4 million, and contributions from health around individual care packages, such as continuing healthcare packages, which are also significant.
Thanks, John. So any questions on that section, or indeed this is the end of the revenue part of the budget? Any questions on the revenue budget in general? Jules?
How are we going to deliver that? Is that, do we have the infrastructure already, or are we just going to hand over that money to somebody? I can't remember now, because we didn't spend anything hardly last year in the budget.
So the Skills Funding Agency funding funds our adult learning service, the Leicestershire Adult Learning Service, and what it will show on the budget line as a zero balance, because the money comes in from the Skills Funding Agency and then we spend it in its entirety. So it doesn't in effect cost the council to provide the adult learning service. The Skills Funding Agency fund it centrally. So it funds all of those adult learning programs, the Go Learn programs, all of the work we do with people around adult learning. Other than there is some people obviously also contribute, because we charge for some of our for the non educational courses. We charge people, so we do get funding that way as well. But that's the reason why it shows up as zero on the budget, because it's simply a grant that the council receives, and then we spend that grant on providing adult education services to people. So there's no new infrastructure. It's the same infrastructure that we have in place every year. Obviously, it was hit by COVID last year, but we're hoping that we can get back to a level of a sort of a more normal level, if you like, albeit that actually probably we'll still continue to provide some courses remotely because it's quite effective to some people.
I always wish we could have a proper accounting system in local government allied to how businesses operate. Would make life so much easier, but a wish for another day. Any further questions on the revenue side, or indeed this section? In which case we move into the final section, which is the capital programme, which is paragraph 66 to 68, pages 27 to 28, and appendix D on page 37.
Thank you. So we, in adults, although we spend an awful lot of revenue, we're very big, probably the highest departmental spender of revenue in the council. We have a fairly small capital budget compared to environment, transport, children and family services or others. So we have £27 million in our capital programme, the vast majority of which is accounted for by the Disabled Facilities Grant. So that's money that we get in and then we passport directly into the districts. So it's not money that we spend. It goes through the Better Care Fund straight into the district councils. So the main element of capital funding that we have currently in the programme is for the Social Care Investment Programme. And that capital is there to develop independent living for people in the community, the dementia care facility that I mentioned earlier, and to work with partners to find alternatives to long-term care. Yeah, I think for the capital programme.
Any questions? Sure.
John, just on the Disabled Facilities Grant, we passport that over to the districts. Some districts are sitting on it from last year and the year before because of COVID impacts. Do we have any requirements for them to spend it within the year, or any say in that at all?
There are requirements on the Disabled Facilities Grants, but they are requirements on the district and borough councils. They're not requirements on the county council. It simply just goes into our account and it goes out of our account. We don't report on it as such. The expenditure is reported by each of the district and borough councils. We do work kind of jointly in terms of where we think the priorities are, and obviously in terms of the individual spend, much of that expenditure is actually determined, I suppose, on the back of assessments that we do in the county council. So we assess people for their level of need, and then the district councils look at whether they can apportion a DFG to it, and also the contributions that people can make. I think the government are looking to be more flexible in the future wherever possible, and to allow housing authorities to be a little bit more flexible in how they can spend it, because I think it's been a bit rigid up to now. So I know there is some work going on in government to think about whether or not they can perhaps include elements of revenue or not as part of the DFG, and to allow people to be a bit more flexible in terms of some of the audit requirements. But yeah, the districts and boroughs are responsible for auditing DFG.
Thanks, John. I'd give an observation on it from talking to my district colleagues, and indeed from experience within my division. I think one of the problems is that A, during COVID, people haven't wanted people to go into their houses, and B, just getting builders to actually do the works is a nightmare with the amount of building work that's been done. Well, almost every property wall down in the street is having an extension at the moment, so there's just a dearth of building. I think one of the key factors that John mentioned is that, you know, a simple thing like a grab for somebody to pick something up off the floor, which would greatly help them, they can't spend out that budget because it's a 1-year depreciation, so it's classified as revenue, not capital. So I think the point that John made about changes in the scheme, so it would behove all of us to lobby our MPs for changes in that scheme, which is a great scheme, but just needs to provide greater flexibility for councils to provide what people need, rather than worry about whether it's classified as capital or revenue. If it's what they need as the disabled facility grant, it strikes me as what they need, and I would urge, and that's why I'm using this little soapbox to say, any MPs listening, please change the rules so we can get that money out quicker and assist people of staying and being comfortable in their own homes. I think finally, Christine, I don't know if there's any general observations you want to make as portfolio holder on the budgets before we go on to the next section.
No, not really. I think the questions have come from the floor have been very helpful, and I think John's answered most of the questions, and anything that Ted and I think we need to follow up, we will follow up.
Thank you, Christine, and thanks all members. I mean, as John says, it is one of the largest budgets in the council, and I think that it's clear that members have read the papers in detail and asked questions that have come from it. So I'd thank everybody for the diligence they've put into this on what is a very crucial subject. We're now moving on to agenda item 9. Oh, sorry, I did forget to thank Judith for her contribution as well to that report. I know it was small but very valuable, Judith, and thanks to John. We now move on to agenda item 9, which is adult social care reform and charging, as set out on pages 39 to 48 of the agenda pack. Are you doing this, John, or is Nigel doing it? So as it says on my paper, sometimes I know he leaps in, Nigel, so I just thought I'd better check first, which is with Nigel as Thomas, the Assistant Director. I think members have read, obviously, the paper, Nigel, so just pick out any salient points you want, then we'll take questions.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, everybody. Yep, so this is really picking out the main points of the government's proposed reform of social care set out in its document, which is called People at the Heart of Care, and also there's a section in the report around its proposed charging reform, which was set out under the Build Back Better plan for health and social care command paper and subsequent policy paper. I won't dwell on the background other than to say that the government's announced 5.4 billion over 3 years for the reform of social care, and that would become in 2 main areas. 3.6 billion to pay for charging reform and 1.7 billion to improve access to social care, including a 500 million investment in the workforce. Paragraph 6 just sets out the objectives of the white paper, very much linked, as referenced in paragraph 8, to the existing Care Act. So, you know, sort of not a huge amount of surprise in terms of its narrative and approach. So paragraphs 9 to 21 of the report just break down some of the main themes of where the government have set out their proposals of reform. And what I will do is I will just focus on the ones where they're planning or have made specific recommend proposals around investment. So the first of those is that social care workforce, paragraph 11. That's announcing the investment of some 500 million over the next 3 years to support the workforce, targeting really knowledge, skills, health, well-being and recruitment policies to improve social care as a long-term career choice, very much making the point that the social care workforce has a high turnover, it has a number of pressures, all of which I'm sure we're aware of, and that's funding to support that. Paragraphs 12 and 13 is talking about how people find out and make informed choices around the care and support that they get and how they navigate the care system. So here there's a proposal to invest around 5 million to test and evaluate new ways to help people navigate local adult social care systems, including potentially the development of a national website. And also paragraph 13, 25 million invested to work with the sector to kickstart a change in the services provided to support unpaid carers. We've talked about the role and the value of technology, and that's dealt with in paragraphs 14 to 17. Two particular things there, the investment or proposal to invest around 150 million over the next 3 years to drive digitisation across the sector and unlock the potential of care tech innovation. And then an additional 30 million innovative models of care programme, which will be launched. And the aim of that will be to support local systems to build the culture and capability to embed digitisation into the mainstream models of care. Paragraph 18, expanding the choice of housing options. There, the paper sets out the ambition really to think housing and community when thinking about housing choices within the care market, whether that be new or existing homes, access to digital technologies again to enable people to make informed choices, but also the existing housing stock, how that can be changed and adapted to help people live independently there for longer. And so intention there to invest around 300 million over the next 3 years to embed the strategic commitment to connect housing with health and care to drive the stock of new supported housing. And in addition, there's an intention to fund a new service to make minor repairs and changes on existing housing to enable people to remain independent and safe in places where they're already living. We just touched earlier on a disabled facilities grant. There's a commitment there to a further 570 million a year for 2022-23. Increase the upper limit of the disabled facilities grant. Within the 300 million connected with housing, the government stating the intention to continue to invest in the Care and Support Specialised Housing Fund with a 71 million capital funding per year, again from 22 to 25. And that's to incentivise the supply of specialist housing for older people and people with a physical disability, learning disability, autism or mental ill health. Paragraphs 23 onwards set out, there's a section on how it wants to support local authorities to deliver this reform, and to draw your attention to paragraph 25 with a proposal for a funding of 70 million between 22 to 25 to ensure that local authorities are set up to deliver the vision that's set out in the white paper. And as part of that, we will be required as a local authority to submit to the Department of Health and Social Care, particularly in the market, a cost of care exercise that reflects local costs such as staff pay, travel, a provisional market sustainability plan setting out a local strategy for the next 3 years, and a spend report which details when we know in more detail what allocations we will get, how we spend that. And paragraphs 27 really go into the preparation for assurance, and as part of the proposals, the government's proposing to introduce a duty for the CQC to independently review and assess local authority performance in delivering those duties under the Care Act. Paragraph 28 just really looks at the focus areas where, when we know more about that assessment process, the things that they'll be likely to focus on. So things like qualities of leadership, the carrying out of safeguarding duties, the oversight of the social care workforce, and so on. Moving on then to the reform of charging, I think you will know through the local media and national media a lot about the proposals here. This was set out in the command paper and subsequent policy paper. And the main points there are set out in paragraph 31, particularly the introduction of a new £86,000 cap on the amount anyone in England will need to spend on their personal care over their lifetime, and the plan to implement that using legislation already in place for the 2014 Care Act. The upper capital threshold in the financial assessment, which a person is liable for the full cost of their care and support, will increase from £23,250 to £100,000, whilst the lower threshold will increase from £14,250 to £20,000. We know that care accounts will need to be maintained by the local authority, so regular care account statements so people can fully engage with understanding sort of how their eligibility affects them and how we charge for it. And also residential self-funders will be able to require the local authority to arrange their care. Currently, they can only request the local authority to do so. So that will have an impact, potential impact on the amounts of requests we get to find and arrange care for self-funders. Paragraphs 32 and 33 just summarise the response. There's still a lot of detail to be clarified around the reforms. For example, the details of charging on self-funders and the precise nature of the assurance frameworks, which I've touched on. So when we're beginning to put in place plans to respond to this, they will have to be flexible to change as we find out more detail. Paragraphs 34 onwards set out our response, and currently detailed work is being carried out to look at the impact on service users, including any equalities impacts, the resource requirements on the council, and the necessary changes to policy and practice which will arise as this reform agenda gets underway. And paragraph 35 has just got some bullet points which set out some of the things that are already in place or are being planned for. So very briefly, that's the main points of the report itself. So I'll finish there.
Thanks very much, Nigel. I described this earlier as a blueprint for what this committee will be looking at for the next probably 2 years, which I think is hopefully a fair description, Ross.
Thank you. Last time we met, we spoke about our potential partnership with Hampshire and how we could digitise social care in Hampshire, and obviously we spoke about it today as well. Fortunately, that's a key aim of the paper. I appreciate it's kind of early days yet. There's not much meat on the bone, but I was wondering what your thoughts are on how what's been announced could influence or impact our pre-existing plans.
Well, I think certainly we're heading in the right direction in terms of that. We'd look to see how we can utilise any funding that's made available to add value to that work. In terms of the work at Hampshire itself, we are working towards a soft launch in April for the new care technology service. And that will, I think has been alluded to earlier on, really place technology certainly much more centrally into the care pathway pathway, if you like. Certainly when assessments are done and so forth, the questions around, well, is there a technological solution to this, will be front and centre. That's not to say, as we've already referenced as well, that it's for everybody. We know, and the white paper itself makes the point of the amount of older people, particularly, that don't engage with technology. And also, it's very, very important that this isn't technology for technology's sake. It is around people's outcomes. So if there is a solution where either an individual or their friends and family can support that person to live independently for longer by use of technology, then hopefully we will have a framework and a robust framework able to do that. Part of that work, I should say as well, is really looking at a robust way in which we measure the financial impact of that, whether that be through avoided cost elsewhere or actually through efficiency savings.
Barry?
Thank you, Chair. And Nigel, when we get these figures, 5.9 billion, etc., 300 million for this, 500 million for that, do we actually have a gut feel for what percentage of that comes our way? Because obviously our residents, when they see these figures, they go, yeah, it's for the country. What's it mean to us here?
It's quite difficult at this stage to actually outline, sort of exactly what we will get. I don't know whether Judy's still on the call, but I would have, I wouldn't like to be saying, oh well, it'll be around this area or that area. Some of it actually might be, particularly in terms of technology, it might be things that we have to bid for. But it's very difficult to know how that allocation will come through, and that's obviously the clarification that we'll be waiting for.
Amanda?
You talked about care tech and how hopefully that is going to be expanded. Are we talking about monitoring of elderly patients, or how would that work?
It'll work in a whole number of different ways. From its most basic, it might be buying somebody or installing for somebody an Amazon Echo Dot that can remind them to do a variety of things. It can move up to more complex, but perhaps more sophisticated monitoring equipment. So, for example, if somebody has dementia as a family member, I might have an app that actually shows how my mother moves around the house in a particular area, and alerts to the fact that if she's opening the door, for example, at 1 o'clock in the morning, that's something that I might want to know about. Part of that will include an alert service, which would if there is something coming through, there will be an alert service through our partnership with Hampshire to check with friends and family, but also in an emergency funnel that through to emergency services if required.
Just as a follow-up on that, in answer to Ross, you said that you were going to be looking at the financial impact and trying to measure that. Measuring that kind of thing, I would imagine, is remarkably difficult. How would you even start to measure that from a financial impact perspective?
Well, part of the reason why we're sort of in a strategic partnership with Hampshire is they've had, some 5 or 6 years, experience in how they measure that. And that might not be Leicestershire's way, but certainly one of the work streams that's currently being undertaken is establishing for Leicestershire what that might mean in a robust way, in terms of if, for example, we supplied a worker with some piece of technology which enables them to, go out to their workplace, for example, that might avoid cost. If we're commissioning, home care visits to help somebody do a particular task. So things like, double-handed care, if there's a way of reducing that amount of double-handed care going into somebody's house, for example, that is something that we could map out and cost out as a result of a piece of technology. It's not to say that we'd remove domiciliary care visit potentially, but if it enables the fact that you could reduce it from 4 visits a day to 3 or maybe 2, then there's a cost that can be captured as part of that and reflected back into the benefits.
Any further questions? No, I think this is just to make comments. I think it's a very useful report. I said it gives us a way forward in terms of what we'll be looking at going forward. And I'd urge members to hang on to these questions they've asked, and then we can keep a continual check on what's happened as we go forward. I just hope that the government don't put us through bidding hurdles and actually start funding us directly rather than wasting lots of time here and putting in bids. But I think that's probably a forlorn hope, looking at John's face. So we'll now move on to the final report of the day, which is agenda item 10, which is the National Performance Benchmark 2020-21 and Performance Report 2021-22, position as at November 2021. Which is with Matt, who's decided not to grace us with his presence today, but he's on screen. So lovely to see you again, Matt.
Thank you very much.
And as I said to Nigel, members will have read the report. So if there's just any specific points you wish to expand on, that will be useful. If not, we go straight into questions.
Yeah, happy. Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, happy to do a brief summary of the report. Just before I do get into that, I'm more than happy to respond later to one of the questions from earlier in the meeting with regards the average length of temporary placements that I think was raised in one of the previous items. But for now, I'll get into the report. As with previous reports to the January committee, it comes in two parts. Firstly, we will pick up on the benchmarking side. That is looking at how we compare nationally during the year 2020-21. And secondly, we'll look at an up-to-date position for the current performance year, and that covers the period April to November. In terms of the benchmarking, it's worth noting that obviously 2020-21 was the first full year since the outbreak of COVID-19, and the national figures reflect some of the impact that this has had on performance. So I'll start with the benchmarking elements on paragraph 9. This includes comparative information from a number of different publications. Firstly, the Adult Social Care Outcomes Framework, which I've spoken about before, but it's shortened to ASCOF. There were only 13 metrics benchmarked in the ASCOF in 2020-21 due to changes with the statutory surveys that we undertake. I think members will be aware of these two surveys that we have to do. The carers one was due in the COVID year, and that was postponed to 12 months, and that went out in the autumn just gone. And the other survey we do of people receiving a service, that became voluntary during the COVID period, and I think less than 20 authorities undertook it. Again, that's come back round, and that survey will be actually being posted out in the next week or so. Supporting people's independence and avoiding unnecessary admissions to care are key aspects of the target operating model. And in Leicester, there has been a reduced number of permanent care admissions during the past few years. Paragraph 11 outlines how in 2020-21 this was no different. However, there was an impact of COVID in the first kind of 5 to 6 months of that year, and we have seen a national drop in the number of admissions through the period April to around about September of 2020. Across the East Midlands, 39% of service users were in permanent care placements during 2020-21. In Leicestershire, that portion was slightly lower, it's at 34%. Over the past couple of years, this trend has been a move away from the use of permanent care into community-based provision. Looking at Leicestershire specifically, the number of people in permanent care at a rate of per 100,000 of the population was 429, and that compares to 500 across the region. That level I've just explained there of 429 per 100,000 population is also actually lower than the Shire authorities in the region too. So supporting people to gain or regain independence following a spell of reablement has always been a strong area of performance for Leicestershire. However, and kind of as expected, I guess, the complexity of people's needs, which I think was touched on earlier, following a hospital discharge during 2020-21, was such that fewer people were able to benefit from the service, both in Leicestershire and nationally. Paragraph 14 highlights how performance has fallen, although it remains above the national average for the proportion of people both living at home for 91 days post-reablement and for those not needing ongoing services directly after the service. Moving on and away from ASCOF, in October last year, the Care Quality Commission published the annual report, State of Healthcare and Adult Social Care in England. This gives information on quality of care provided. In Leicestershire, 74% of residential providers were rated as good or outstanding, whilst it was slightly higher nationally at 85%. Looking at community providers, the equivalent figures were 89% in Leicestershire and 88% nationally. Final aspect, briefly on benchmarking, touches on the library services, starting on paragraph 17. Based on the CIPFA analysis of libraries activity, performance in Leicestershire tends to be a bit lower than our comparator authorities, and this is around the areas of traditional aspects of the service. However, a strategic investment in children and family book stock has been undertaken, and this reflected in the figures with a higher area of performance. Note also perhaps that the CIPFA methodology in some ways is slightly outdated and doesn't necessarily reflect the changing landscape of the library service. I'll briefly move on then to the latest position, and this, as I said, covers the period of April to November of the current performance year. So we're aware that heritage sites reopened in the spring of last year, and a target has been agreed of 214,000 both physical and website visits during the year. Current activity levels are on track to meet this, and it's a similar position in the library service, with the level of visits and issues, and within that I do include the ever increasing number of e-loans, are all on track to meet the targets. Paragraph 25 highlights the National Literacy Trust research. This has been brought in off the back of a question at the last time I was with the committee. And that research during recent lockdowns into the benefit of audio books for children. In Leicestershire, the library service has been investing in its digital platform, and approximately 10,000 children's e-books and audiobooks were issued in the early months of the pandemic and continue to be comparatively high throughout that summer. Paragraph 29 notes how employment and accommodation levels for working age adults with a learning disability were higher than the national average in 2021. And although falling short of the current target, it does remain comparatively high. Although overall numbers remain down on pre-pandemic levels, our reablement services have bounced back from that reduced performance that I noted a moment ago, and are on track to meet the targets this year. The level of admissions to permanent care, which we touched on previously for the national picture, these are currently higher than wished this year. And as such, the full year forecast is higher than the maximum target. This is particularly notable for working age adults, but as I noted at the last meeting, this is primarily due to a recording issue, and system corrections are now underway to improve that position. Finally, just touching on paragraph 34, this outlines the performance in relation to undertaking annual reviews. The proportion of people reviewed in the past 12 months was slightly lower in 2020-21, and that was due to review resources being moved around to support the hospital discharges. Performance has bounced back somewhat in the current year, and between April and November 21, that was averaging at 68%. So that's a quick run through that report. Happy to take any questions or comments. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Matt. Any questions? Joe.
Thank you, Chair. It's nice to see so much green on the report, which is a positive considering the years or the couple of years that we've come out of. But I did want to touch on one of the reds, or the only red I saw, which was the learning disabilities, getting people with learning disabilities into work. We know from the press that employment is racing ahead. So is it a lag between what's happening on the ground and reporting, or is there a difficulty getting people into employment with learning disabilities?
I certainly can respond to that question from a performance position, and I don't know whether John or Nigel would want to add to that a bit from the policy context within the department. We've been very high with this indicator, and whilst it's red in the current year, and we saw a small reduction last year as well, we are somewhat higher than the national average. The national average is around about 5%. Last year we were at 10.5%, and I think the report currently is showing it around 9 to 10%. So although we are seeing this reduction, we still remain considerably higher than any national average on this indicator.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think couple of things to say. One is that it was an extremely difficult year. So whilst we are, as you said, seeing a very buoyant employment market now, we certainly weren't when some of these figures were put together. I think people with learning disabilities are particularly at risk from COVID. And if you look at all sort of activity around people with learning disabilities, whether it's employment or whether it's day services or whether it's all, then you will see that there has been a significant reduction in people wanting to take part in some of those external activities because of the risk attached. I do think it's something that we can refocus on as we go sort of coming into the next financial year, and we can have a look at that. We certainly, when we did the CLC procurement, the recent commissioning of a new CLC framework, one of the areas that we specifically asked providers to look at was employment. So we do have some providers on the framework who are specifically targeting employment for people with learning disabilities. So it's something we can come back to.
Thanks, Jill, for bringing that up. I mean, we discussed it in our group earlier, and I think it's a thing we're all keen to do what we can to assist those people getting to employment, which a large number of them actually want. I think the statistic is 60% of people with learning difficulties would like to work. So anything we can do to assist, I think this committee would want to look at it at the appropriate time once we have the staff resource to do it, John. Any further questions on the report? You've got away lightly again, Matt. Even though you decided not to come, you still got away lightly. We'll have a plethora of questions. We'll have to put you on first on the agenda one of these times. I think you'll probably suffer more. But thanks very much, Matt.
Okay, thank you.
The date of the next meeting is the 7th of March 2022 at 2 p.m. In the absence of no urgent items being taken, I declare the meeting closed, and thank you to all.